My daughter married a man whose company was valued at $400 million, and every single person at that vineyard reception told me they were the perfect couple. During our father-daughter dance, while the string quartet played something I can't remember now, she pressed a folded piece of paper into my jacket pocket, with the quiet desperation of someone slipping a message through prison bars. I felt it the moment it left her fingers, something small and tight and heavier than it had any right to be. Before I go any further, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to fight for someone you love against a monster who knew exactly how to wear a perfect face, hit like and subscribe. My name is Calvin Dunbar. I'm 64 years old, a retired mining engineer who spent 3 decades working the nickel deposits in Sudbury, and another decade doing geological survey consulting for residential developers across southern Ontario. That second career is the one that matters for this story. When you spend years reading soil composition maps and identifying what lies beneath a piece of land before a single shovel breaks ground, you develop an instinct for hidden things. You learn to trust what the earth keeps quiet. My wife Linda passed away 3 years ago. Ovarian cancer caught too late. If she had been at that vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake watching our daughter dance with me, she would have seen it before I did. Linda always saw what was underneath people. Our daughter Paige was 31 and had been dating Dorian Blackwell for 14 months before he proposed. He was 36, the founder of Blackwell Systems, a Toronto-based company that designed and installed what he called integrated AI home intelligence for wealthy clients. Cabinet ministers in Ottawa, executives on Bay Street, old money in the annex. He'd been on the cover of Business in Canada twice. He was generous with compliments, seamless at conversation, and had a way of making you feel like the most important person in any room without you ever being able to explain exactly how he did it. The ceremony was at a Niagara-on-the-Lake winery overlooking the lake, 240 guests, a photographer who'd flown in from Montreal. Dorian's money was visible in everything. The imported flower arrangements, the open bar that never ran dry, the shuttle coaches ferrying guests back to the hotel at 10-minute intervals. Linda always said you could read a man's character by how he spent money. I thought about that observation all evening. When Paige and I stepped onto the dance floor, I noticed almost immediately that something was wrong. Not wrong in the way that nerves are wrong, or the way any bride might be overwhelmed on a long day in August heat. Wrong in the way a mineshaft sounds different when the structural integrity isn't what it should be. A hollow under the sound, a shift in the load. She wasn't swaying, she was holding herself together. I pulled her slightly closer. Her hands were trembling, not a flutter, a violent, involuntary shake. Her skin was ice-cold despite the warmth inside that reception tent, and when I placed my palm against her back, I felt how rigid she was, how every muscle was braced, the way a structure braces when it knows what's coming. She pressed her face into my shoulder, and away from the cameras, away from the row of guests pointing their phones at us, and breathed 2 words into my ear. Keep smiling. And then her hand moved carefully down my jacket and pushed something deep into my breast pocket, and her fingers gripped the edge of that pocket for exactly 1 second, the way a person grips the last solid handhold before a drop they can't survive. I kept my arm around her back. I kept moving to the music. I looked out at the room with the face of a man who had everything he could have wished for. Before the song ended, Dorian was beside us. He didn't ask to cut in, he simply appeared and placed his hand on Paige's bare shoulder, and the weight of that hand. I had spent a career watching inexperienced site supervisors use physical presence to remind workers who owned the ground beneath their feet. Was not the hand of a man welcoming a dance. It was the hand of a man reclaiming property. I stepped off the floor. The room applauded. I found the men's restroom at the back of the reception hall, locked myself in, and smoothed the folded paper open against the granite countertop. She'd torn it from a cocktail napkin. The handwriting was hers, but barely. Rushed and shaky, and nothing like the careful, deliberate script on the wedding invitations she'd spent 3 weeks choosing. 3 words, pressed hard into the paper as though she'd needed to anchor them. Dad, help me. I read them 4 times. I folded the paper back along its creases and returned it to my pocket. I stood at that sink and looked at my own reflection for a long, quiet moment. Then I went back out and danced with my daughter and said nothing. Because whatever was happening, the middle of that reception tent was the wrong place to start. For 3 weeks after the wedding, I could not reach my daughter. Her phone went to a voice assistant, Dorian's proprietary AI, that told me in a pleasant synthesized tone that Mrs. Blackwell was unavailable. Texts came back from her number, brief and oddly punctuated. Settling in, Dad. Very busy. Love you. Paige had never once in her 31 years signed a text to me with love you. She always wrote love you or put 3 X's at the end. It was a small thing, I noticed it on the second message and couldn't stop noticing it after that. On the 22nd day, I drove south on the 400 and then cut west onto the rural roads that wind up through the Caledon Hills. Dorian's estate sat at the top of a ridge, gated and surveilled and wrapped in the kind of architectural confidence that money buys when it isn't comfortable being observed. Smart locks, camera domes tucked under every eave, security lighting that shifted color when a vehicle it didn't recognize came within range. The front gate had a biometric panel. When I pressed the intercom, the AI voice I'd come to loathe told me that Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell were not receiving unannounced visitors at this time. I was still sitting in my idling car when a delivery van from a premium organic grocer rolled up behind me. I watched the driver hold a keycard to the panel. The gate opened. I waited until the van was halfway through, and I followed close enough behind that the perimeter sensors read us as a single vehicle. The gate closed behind me. The pathway lighting shifted immediately from white to amber. I'd tripped something. Dorian was already at the front door by the time I reached the motor court. He shook my hand with the practiced warmth of a man for whom warmth has become a technical skill, called me by my first name twice in 2 sentences, and steered me inside with one hand hovering just behind my shoulder. Paige came down the floating staircase wearing a heavy cable-knit sweater, the sleeves pulled all the way to her knuckles. It was 27 degrees Celsius outside. The air conditioning inside wasn't cold enough to explain it. When I hugged her, I pressed my thumb gently against the inside of her left wrist beneath the wool. What I found there, raised skin, hot and swollen, the unmistakable topography of a grip bruise, individual fingers preserved in the tissue, stopped every rational thought in my body. I kissed her cheek. I said something ordinary. I kept my face completely still. Dorian stayed in the room for the entire visit. When a glass slipped from Paige's trembling hands in the kitchen and shattered across the Italian marble, he didn't raise his voice. That was the most frightening part. He simply lowered it. He said with the patient tone of a man who understood exactly what quiet damage could do, "You really do need to be more careful with our things, darling." She got down on her bare knees and gathered the broken glass with her bare hands. I moved forward and he stepped between us, his broad shoulders filling the space, his expression pleasant as a door closing in your face. I performed gratitude and relief on the way out. Reassured father, silly old man who'd overreacted, everything clearly fine. 2 armed security contractors materialized from the tree line before I'd reached my car. One of them told me, in polite professional language, that future unannounced visits would be classified as criminal trespass and reported to the OPP immediately. I thanked them. I drove away. At the bottom of the hill, I pulled onto the gravel shoulder. In the 2 seconds I'd had with Paige on the front step, Dorian behind us, cameras above us, she had pressed her lips against my ear and spoken in a rapid clinical whisper that stunned me more than anything else that day. Not a plea, not a name, coordinates, precise, memorized, delivered like a soldier passing a map reference. Latitude, longitude, locker number. She was not broken, she was fighting from inside the walls. The coordinates resolved to Union Station in Toronto. Lower level, GO train concourse, locker 847. I tried 3 combinations before the right one came to me. April 23rd, Linda's birthday, 423. The lock released. Inside on the bare metal shelf was a black USB drive. I didn't go home. I drove 4 hours north on the 11 to Muskoka. Stewart had done 22 years in financial crimes with the RCMP before he bought 40 acres outside Huntsville, disconnected most of his phone lines, and started answering only to people he trusted completely. We'd met when I was brought in as an expert witness on a mining fraud case near Timmins. Someone had been salting drill core samples to inflate an ore deposit before a public share offering, and Stewart had been the investigator. He'd needed someone who could explain the deception to a jury without using jargon. We'd respected each other since. His basement was lined with copper mesh, a Faraday cage. The laptop inside had never touched a network. He treated the USB drive the way you'd treat an unknown substance at a surface site, with instruments first, assumptions never. He ran diagnostics for 40 minutes before he opened the first directory. When the files populated on screen, he sat back in his chair and didn't speak for a long time. Financial ledgers, millions of dollars moving through shell corporations registered in British Columbia. The kind of layered, nameless holding structures that had been at the center of money laundering investigations for a decade. Isle of Man, dummy corporations with no employees, no offices, no function, except to receive funds and plow them deeper into the architecture. The totals were staggering. The names attached to the outgoing payments were not obscure. They were names from the news, federal representatives, a provincial court judge, 3 executives from firms I recognized from Bay Street business coverage. Blackwell Systems was a listening device with a storefront. Every installation was a surveillance node. Every senator or cabinet minister or managing director who had paid $80,000 for a fully integrated AI home intelligence system had funded their own wiretapping. Dorian had compiled dossiers on 43 of the most consequential people in this country. Affairs, fraud, back-channel negotiations, things said behind closed doors in the absolute certainty of privacy. He called the ongoing extortion payments premium consulting retainer fees. A secondary encrypted folder required Page's voice or biometric authentication. We couldn't break it, we didn't need to. I spent 3 days at my workbench with old survey maps. When I had done geological consulting work in the Caledon Hills 15 years earlier, one of the parcels I assessed was the ridge where Dorian's estate now stood. The escarpment formation there is limestone, porous and fissured, with natural drainage channels running through the bedrock. During the pre-development assessment, a survey access tunnel had been bored into the slope, 19 centimeters wide, 50 centimeters tall, intended for core sampling at depth. When the zoning plan changed and the tunnel was no longer needed, the entrance had been sealed with a timber frame and left to be reclaimed by the hillside. The tunnel itself remained intact because removing it would have destabilized the rock face above. 14 inches of solid limestone blocks wireless frequencies. No thermal imaging camera, no motion sensor, no digital signal sniffer in that estate could read through that much dense rock. And I knew exactly where the entrance was, because I was the one who had marked it on the original survey. The plan was straightforward and genuinely frightening to execute. I would trigger a controlled power failure at the municipal utility junction on the public road below the gate, a pressurized water surge into the electrical conduit, the kind of failure that happened on older infrastructure, especially in wet weather, completely plausible to any crew responding later. That would give me roughly 10 minutes before Dorian's backup generator cycled up and his security network rebooted. In those 10 minutes I had to find the tunnel, crawl 45 meters through solid rock, and secure the device Stewart had assembled, an analog low-frequency transmitter salvaged from mine rescue equipment, the kind engineered to push a signal up through hundreds of meters of limestone to reach a trapped worker. It ran on a sealed internal battery and broadcast on a frequency band so obsolete that modern digital sniffers weren't even programmed to recognize it. The night I went in, it was past midnight and raining steadily. I'd borrowed a Hydro One utility vest, grabbed my canvas tool bag, and walked up the road in the dark. The municipal junction was exactly where the survey records placed it. I forced the water surge. The crack of the short circuit was loud enough to startle me. I watched the amber security lights on the ridge go black. I ran. The tunnel entrance was where I remembered it, buried under sumac and 15 years of leaf fall, but the timber frame was still solid. I pulled the debris away and lay flat on my stomach. I've spent my career underground, 3 decades in the Sudbury Basin, but the Sudbury mines have head frames and shaft elevators and the company of other men. There was nothing like that 45 meters. The limestone pressed against my shoulders and back and both sides simultaneously, and the air was cold and dead and tasted of old rust. And the only light was the beam of a headlamp strapped to my forehead that showed me exactly how little space I had. I moved on my elbows and the tips of my boots, one body length at a time. Halfway through, I stopped. I lay still in the dark and waited for the panic to pass, the way you wait underground for a bad moment to move through you before it makes you do something stupid. I thought about Linda. I thought about Paige on her knees on that marble floor, picking up broken glass with her bare hands, afraid to look up. I kept moving. At the end of the tunnel, I rolled onto my back, reached the transmitter out of the bag, and pressed the magnetic base against the limestone ceiling above me. The green indicator light blinked once. I checked my watch. 8 minutes, 50 seconds. I crawled backward faster than I'd gone in, and when I pulled myself out into the rain, the estate lights were already flickering as the generators came back online. I was moving toward the tree line when a flashlight beam caught me from 20 meters away. The security contractor was large and not slow. I was already standing, already in the borrowed Hydro One vest, already looking like a miserable utility worker who'd spent 45 minutes in the mud-checking drainage infrastructure after a grid failure in the rain. He kept the light on my face for a long, flat moment. "Get back to the public road," he said. I thanked him. I did not run. Stewart had the van parked 2 kilometers downhill, the analog receiver warm and running. I climbed in, shut the door, and we sat and waited. 17 minutes passed, then the speaker broke open. Dorian's voice came through the static like something that had been living in the dark and resented being heard. The warmth was completely absent. What remained was flat and contemptuous in a way that turned my stomach in a way few things in my life have. He told Paige what she was useful for. The optics of a good working-class Ontario family, the wholesome respectability of a wife from outside his world, the legal protection afforded by the doctrine of spousal privilege under Canadian law, which prevented a spouse from being compelled to testify against a partner in criminal proceedings. And then he told her about Georgian Bay. They would leave Collingwood Harbour on Friday aboard his sailing yacht. A long weekend on the open water. The meteorological forecast called for a squall system pushing in from Lake Huron late Saturday night. Paige would go overboard in the storm. She would not come back up. The $15 million life insurance policy he'd registered on her 3 months after the wedding would pay out in liquid capital. The international investors who had backed Blackwell Systems in its early days, and who were now calling in their returns in cash, not equity, would be satisfied, and he would emerge as a grieving widower without a loose end in the world. He'd also addressed me. Over the 6 weeks I'd spent waiting and worrying, his team had quietly routed $1.4 million in laundered funds through my registered retirement account via a chain of shell transactions that on paper traced directly back to my home network. An anonymous tip had already been filed with the CRA. If I raised any alarm after Paige's death, if I spoke to police, demanded an inquest, questioned anything, the investigation would open and it would bury me. He would cooperate with authorities fully. A devastated husband discovering his late wife's father was connected to the very criminal enterprise that had been using his platform. He had thought of everything. He'd planned for every contingency. Except he'd never once had to calculate what a 64-year-old mining engineer who had nothing left to lose was capable of. I called him the next morning. I let my voice crack. I told him I'd been sitting alone in my house in Sudbury. I'd moved back there after Linda, and I was ashamed of how I'd behaved. I told him I could see how much he cared for Paige, and that I had let grief make me paranoid and invasive, and that I was sorry. I asked if I could come on the Georgian Bay trip, just for the weekend. I just wanted to be near my daughter. I would stay completely out of their way. The pause lasted 8 seconds, I counted. Calvin, he finally said, the warmth reconstructed perfectly. We'd love nothing more. At the Collingwood Marina Friday afternoon, I shuffled up the boarding ramp with a supplemental oxygen tank harnessed to my chest and a walking cane I didn't need, dressed like a man whose joints had finally started keeping score after too many years underground. Dorian met me at the top with a glass of champagne and that seamless, hollow smile. Paige was sitting at the stern in a designer rain jacket, pale and very still. When she saw me, the cane, the tank, the performance of a broken old man, something in her expression collapsed. She thought I had given up. She thought I had come to say goodbye. I gave her one small, steady nod. She looked away. The harbor fell behind us as we pushed north into the open bay. For 2 hours, Dorian performed the role of gracious host, with the commitment of a man who had spent years perfecting it. He pointed out the features of the yacht, poured good wine, told stories about other sailing trips on superior water. And then we crossed far enough into Georgian Bay that the Collingwood lights were invisible behind the weather, and the squall that the forecast had promised started rolling in hard from the northwest the way Georgian Bay storms do, fast and without negotiation, and Dorian stood up and pressed a button on his watch. The crew went below, the deck lights shifted. Both contractors appeared from either side, hands near their waistbands. Dorian reached behind his back. "You walked onto my boat," he said. The mask was completely gone. What was left was very quiet and very certain. "You made this easy." I dropped the walking cane. It skidded across the wet teak toward the railing. "Dorian," I kept my voice even, "you built your entire empire on wireless networks, encrypted signals, and digital surveillance. You understood data. You never needed to understand geology." His hand tightened on the weapon. "That isn't oxygen." I began unfastening the harness. "It's a corrosive reagent compound. I formulated it myself. I've been working with processing chemistry and nickel extraction for 30 years. 2 hours before we boarded, I fed a pressurized line from this tank into your starboard fuel intake. The compound takes 3 hours and 10 minutes to breach the fuel injection housing at operating temperature." I looked at my watch. We crossed that mark 9 minutes ago. The detonation came from below deck before he could move, a deep, structural concussion that ran up through the hull and into the soles of my feet, followed by the shriek of machinery failing catastrophically under heat. The instrument console went dark. Black smoke pushed up through the deck vents. The yacht lurched hard to starboard. Both contractors abandoned their positions for the life raft station without a word. Whatever Dorian paid them, it wasn't enough for Georgian Bay in a squall aboard a sinking vessel. I pressed my heel down on the hidden switch Stewart had built into the sole of my left boot. The emergency position indicating radio beacon, salvaged from Northern Ontario mine rescue equipment, designed to transmit a signal through 400 meters of solid rock to reach a trapped miner, fired a continuous pulse to a satellite relay high above the cloud cover. Stewart, parked in a rented van on the Collingwood waterfront, received the signal simultaneously with the decrypted audio recordings from the Caledon Hills transmitter, and forwarded both to the RCMP Marine Division and the CSIS duty officer within 30 seconds. Dorian came at me fast and I swung the steel cylinder the way you swing any heavy tool underground. Let the mass do the work, commit to the movement, protect your center. The base caught his left knee. The sound it made was not clean. He went down. The weapon went over the railing into Georgian Bay. I pulled Paige behind a steel bulkhead and held her against my chest and listened to the hull groan and the rain drive sideways across the deck, and I did not let go. We heard the rotors before we saw the lights. 2 Canadian Coast Guard helicopters cut through the storm from the south, their floods turning the rain into white curtains. RCMP officers fast-roped onto the deck with a precision that made the whole terrible night feel, for one brief moment, like everything was going to be exactly as it should be. Dorian was still on the deck when the cuffs went on. He was shouting names, lawyers, government contacts, the magnitude of what he had on people, and the officer kneeling on his back said nothing at all, just waited him out. He was still shouting when the rescue basket lifted him off the deck. 6 months later, the proceedings made front pages from Halifax to Victoria. 23 charges: conspiracy to commit murder, extortion under the criminal code, unlawful interception of private communications, proceeds of crime. The federal indictment named 41 additional parties: ministers, executives, a sitting judge, whose compromised information was recovered when CS executed the seizure warrant on the Caledon estate. The national scandal that followed was the kind that reshapes careers for a generation. The CRA investigation against me was closed within 3 weeks. RCMP forensic accountants established the fabricated transaction trail and identified the servers that generated it. The planted funds were reversed. My name was cleared before I'd had time to properly worry about it. Blackwell Systems was dissolved. The estate was seized. The offshore accounts were frozen and their contents redirected to a federal asset forfeiture fund. I drove back to Sudbury in October and started sleeping through the night again. On a Saturday morning in November, I made 2 mugs of coffee and watched Paige through the kitchen window, walking the back field in her coat with her hands in her pockets, looking up at the birch trees dropping their last leaves. She was seeing a therapist in Toronto every week. Her decision, her timeline, her terms. She'd started cooking again. She'd called 2 old friends. She laughed at something on the radio the week before, and it was her real laugh. The one I hadn't heard since before all of this, and I had to put down what I was holding and stand still for a moment. She came inside, stomped the mud off her boots, sat across from me, and wrapped both hands around her mug. "You crawled through a rock tunnel for me," she said. "Technically, it was a decommissioned limestone survey access shaft," I said. She shook her head, but she was almost smiling. "I've spent my career underground, learning to read what the earth keeps hidden beneath its surface. The most dangerous failures are never the ones you can see from above. They are the invisible fractures, the ones that have been quietly expanding under pressure for months, for years, long before anything shows on the outside. The people you love will not always be able to tell you when something is wrong. Watch for the things they can't say out loud. The rigid posture, the cold hands, the heavy sweater in August, the note pressed into your pocket like a lifeline thrown in the dark. Those signals are not weakness. They are someone handing you the most important information they have, at enormous personal cost, and trusting you completely with what comes next. Pay attention. Act on it. Don't wait for the structure to collapse before you acknowledge the crack. Because by the time it's visible on the surface, the foundation has usually been failing for a very long time.